Okay, thank you for the introduction. So again, my name is Matt Cooper. I'm from Oregon State University. Today I'll be presenting some results from my master's thesis. My co-authors is my advisor, Ann Nolan, and my collaborator, Mohammed Safiq. So the results that I'll be presenting today are the results of one modeling experiment comparing the sensitivity of the mountain snowpack in a watershed on the east side of the Cascades to a watershed on the west side of the Oregon Cascades. So zooming in to a higher resolution application than the broad regional trends that Phil just presented. So outline, I'm going to start with the significance and motivation, which is the observation that snowpacks are gradually declining throughout the Pacific Northwest in response to a warming climate. But the watershed scale impacts of these trends are uncertain. And so we're interested in modeling sensitivity in watersheds on the east side and the west side of the Cascades to compare how differences in climate across the two sides of the mountain might lead to differences in the sensitivity. So to do that, we use a physically based snowpack model to quantify the sensitivity as a function of elevation, where the sensitivity is defined as the percentage decline or percentage difference in the volumetric snow water equivalent with a 2 degrees Celsius warming. So we quantify the sensitivity versus elevation. We quantify the basin-wide sensitivity integrated across the elevations. And we show what an average snowpack in a 2-degree warming climate looks like compared to historic variability. We're then going to also look briefly at temperature lapse rates, so the rate at which temperature is changing with elevation in the model forcing data that we use to run our model, and then revisit the impacts in light of the differences in the temperature lapse rates in the gridded forcing data to look at how that impacts the conclusions we draw about the sensitivity. So we know in the Pacific Northwest that the snowpacks provide a critical water resource, providing late season stream flow in our Mediterranean climate. In the late summer when there's little precipitation, snowmelt provides water for irrigation, aquatic habitat, recreation in the winter months, and of course municipalities and industry. So we know that snowpack is a critical component of our water resource infrastructure in the Pacific Northwest. But we also know that snowpacks are declining. So here's the canonical figure once again that Phil just showed. The key take-home point that snowpacks are declining, gradually diminishing throughout the Pacific Northwest in particular, and that it's a warming-driven trend. But how these regional trends might emerge at the watershed scale is more uncertain, and so we're interested in looking at how watershed characteristics might lead to differences in sensitivity. So just as an example here, I'm showing two modeled hydrographs of the response of stream flow to a 1.5 degree warming climate in the Oregon Cascades, and this is courtesy of our collaborator Naomi Teague. And here these watersheds differ based on their geology. And so the idea is that differences in the characteristics of a watershed can lead to differences you get a different response to the warming climate depending on the characteristics of the watershed. The question that I'll be exploring here is differences in the climate at the watershed scale. And so this is a map of our study region showing the watersheds that we're modeling. The Mackenzie River Basin is outlined in red. That's our Western Cascades watershed. And the Upper Deschutes River Basin outlined in blue on the eastern side of the Oregon Cascades. So the Western Cascades receive significantly more precipitation than the Eastern Cascades, about 2 meters on average annually compared to just over 0.5 meter on the east side. The west side is more humid than the east side. Average winter wet day temperatures are colder on the west side than the east side, and these statistics are all being computed for the data in our watersheds. The west side has deeper snowpacks than the east side, and so these various climatic differences are sort of what's motivating our hypotheses or questions that there may be a difference in the sensitivity. And so the way that we quantify the sensitivity is by applying a process-based snowmelt energy balance model, so very similar to the VIC model. This model is called Snow model, different model. But it's simulating all of the major radiative and mass fluxes between the snowpack and the atmosphere, discretized across a 100-meter digital elevation model. And we use this model to quantify the seasonal snow accumulation and melt in both watersheds for the period 1989 to 2011. We then apply a 2-degree warming signal to the input temperature forcing data and compute the percentage difference between the snowpack with the 2-degree warming versus the reference historical climate. And so a key research question that we ask is how the sensitivity varies with elevation. So this is one of the key results from this area of study is that sensitivity depends on elevation. And the figure here is from our results for the west side, Mackenzie River Basin. And what we're doing is plotting the reduction, the absolute reduction in snow water equivalent for every grid cell in the modeling domain versus the elevation of that grid cell. And so it basically maps out the sensitivity of the snowpack as a function of elevation. And so what these results suggest is that in the 1,000 to about 1,500 meter elevation band, you find the most sensitive snowpack. You find the largest reduction, the most negative numbers, right? And as you move above that approximately 1,500 meter elevation band, the sensitivity sort of migrates back to smaller numbers, so it's less sensitive at those higher elevations. And this makes sense intuitively that above a given elevation, it's simply cold enough that the snowpack doesn't feel the warming signal as much. So what we do is we run our model independently for the east side and the west side. We calibrate the model independently for each side, each watershed. We compute, in this case now we're going to be computing the percentage difference so that we can compare equally. We compute the percentage decline in snow water equivalent for the east side and the west side, and then we compute the difference between the two and plot that versus elevation. So if the west side has a larger percent decline, it's more sensitive than the east side, and you end up with a negative number. If the east side has a larger percent decline, it's more sensitive, you have a positive number. So if that blue line is in the shaded blue region, then it indicates that at that elevational band, the west side is more sensitive. And so what these results suggest is basically that across most elevations, the west side appears to be more sensitive than the east side, except in the middle elevation band around about 1,500 meters where the east side appears to be more sensitive. In particular, at the highest elevations in the watersheds, the west side appears to be more sensitive. There's a larger percent difference to a 2-degree warming than the east side. Moving on, we can compute the volumetric basin-wide loss of snow water equivalent with 2-degree warming. And so the results suggest an average 56% reduction in peak snow water equivalent, so on the date of peak snow water in the basin, a 56% reduction on the west side and a 30% on the east side. So again, the west side appears to be more sensitive than the east side. However, there is a caveat to this, which is that when we analyzed the model forcing data that we used to run the model, we found a negative bias in the temperature data. So we observed a cold bias in the temperature data. So plotted in the top two panes are the minimum temperature and maximum temperature bias as a function of elevation in the model forcing data. And so what you see is that the bias increases with elevation. And so the rate at which temperature increases or decreases with elevation is commonly referred to as the lapse rate. And so what this is essentially showing is that the model forcing data has a cold bias in the lapse rates. So we perform a bias correction of the model forcing data. And if you'd like to talk to me more about the bias correction after the talk, we can do that. But what I will say is that we use PRISM to bias correct the forcing data. And we compute the lapse rates from all of the available observations in the study region, plot those on the x-axis, and then plot the modeled forcing data lapse rates on the y-axis. And you see that the pink dots are the original data, and you see that those lapse rates are colder than the observed lapse rates, so hence the cold bias with elevation, and that the bias-corrected lapse rates match the observations quite well. So then we go back and we rerun the model with both data sets. So we recalibrate the model with the bias-corrected data, and we already have calibrated the model with the original data set. So this is the figure I showed before with the original data, indicating the west side more sensitive than the east. If we then add in the results with the bias-corrected data, we find a different answer to the question. We find that at high elevations, this red line is the bias-corrected data. We find that the sensitivity is very close to 0 across the high elevations. So now the sensitivity is very similar across the two sides of the range, depending on the data set that we use. So then revisiting the analysis of the basin-wide integrated sensitivity, we saw the 56% reduction in the west side Mackenzie River Basin with the 2-degree warming. Now on the east side with the bias-corrected data, we see a 60% reduction. So now it's not 30% anymore, now it's 60% on the east side, where it was 30% originally with the original data. And so we can also compare how the modeled 2-degree warming climate, Snowpack, compares to historical variability. And so here I've selected 2 representative locations on the west side and east side. These are snowtail stations. So these are monitoring locations that we're using to inform our water resource management decisions with long-term records of snowpack. And the black solid line is the historical normal snowpack. The shaded gray regions are the inner quartile range bounded by the minimum and maximum. Plotted on with the red solid line is the 2-degree warming climate normal snowpack. And then the dashed red line is a 2-degree warming with a 10% increase in precipitation. So we add 10% to all the precipitation records. So the take-home message from this is twofold. First, that with the 2-degree warming, the normal snowpack is in the lowest percentiles of the historical range, and that a 10% increase in precipitation does very little to change that sensitivity. So it's a temperature-driven signal. And to relate that to to the water resources in the region, we saw the 60% loss in basin-wide snow water equivalent on the east side, which is equivalent to 82% of the holding capacity of Lake Billy Chinook, which is the largest reservoir in the region. Whereas on the west side, a 56% decline in basin-wide volumetric SWE is equivalent to 300% of the holding capacity of Cougar Reservoir, which is the largest reservoir in the Mackenzie River Basin. So in both cases, very significant declines in annual snow water equivalent relative to the holding capacity of the region. So to conclude with our findings, we found that warming impacts on snow on both sides of the range are very significant. In the case of basin-wide volumetric SWE, over 50% with a 2-degree warming. Sensitivity appears to be similar at high elevations on both sides of the range, but biased lapse rates or biased forcing data can change the conclusions that you draw about that sensitivity. And so the use of large-scale gridded climate forcing data sets, which we use here to run our model, have certain limitations when applied to the watershed at a high-resolution watershed scale. And with that, I'd like to acknowledge my funding source, the Northwest Climate Science Center, USGS, and Eric Sproles and Glenn Lisson for their contributions to the work. Thank you.
Questions?
Oh, sorry. So I'm Nick Seiler. I'm at the University of Washington, and I'm more on the meteorology side. So I understand sort of what happened or what your model does sort of at the surface, but it's presumably taking meteorological input, and some of that's rain, some of that's snow. How are you adjusting snowfall?
Right. Sure. So the way that that's typically done in these types of models is you partition the total precipitation into solid and liquid precipitation based on a temperature index. So if it's oftentimes the 0 degrees Celsius is chosen, so if it's below 0, it's snow. If it's above, in our case, we don't use a fixed 0 degrees Celsius. We treat that as a parameter it's calibrated, so it's optimized. Because if you think about it, there's a lot of uncertainty related to, because a thermometer says it's 0 degrees Celsius here, there can't be any snow. It doesn't necessarily work that way. So our calibrated temperature threshold is negative 0.5 degrees Celsius. And that's one of the ways that you level the playing field between when I calibrate the model independently for the original data set and the bias corrected data set, you end up with different values for that parameter. And so that, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hi, Robin Vora. So this is just looking at snowpack and not necessarily water availability, right? Because you got those groundwater systems there that complicate things. But
right. This is all above ground precipitation, essentially, snowpack. And we do quantify the snow melt and the combination of snow melt and rain at every week. We can look at that as well. But here I'm just presenting just the snowpack. So this doesn't, these results don't suggest anything about the sensitivity of the water resources in regions that have different underground water.
Thanks. Hi, I'm
Hi.
Susan Dickerson-Lang. Great talk, Matt.
Thanks.
Quick question about snow model and representation of vegetation in snow model, and as well as kind of with east-west sensitivity, how your different vegetation regimes might affect your sensitivity.
Mm-hmm. Sure, that's a great question. And that's something that is definitely a room for improvement in the model. You assign a gridded vegetation data set, and we use the National Land Cover data set. And for every grid cell, there's an associated LAI value with the vegetation cover in that grid cell, and then that gets used in all sorts of the calculations in the model that simulating the interception by the tree canopy, et cetera. But the LAI is constant for all of this land cover of the same type. So to the degree that which the land cover data set captures the variability in the vegetation, that's represented between the east and west.
Hi, I'm Kelly Gleason. You mentioned the biased lapse rates in the calculated using the broad scale climate data, and I was wondering if you've investigated, looked into the spatial and temporal variability of lapse rates calculated using finer scale data or from the observational record. Thanks.
Sure. So in terms of the spatial variability, when we do the bias correction, we use gridded prism data, which has spatial variability implicit in it. In terms of mapping that out, we don't compute the spatial variability of the lapse rates in that sense. We don't compute lapse rates as a function of elevation, for example. But in terms of the seasonal variability, we have this very complicated figure here that shows that. So if you're interested in seasonal variability of temperature lapse rates and how those deviate from, for example, the 6.5 degrees Celsius per kilometer, it's commonly assumed that's the black dotted line. For every month in our historical period, the box plots show the distribution of monthly average temperature lapse rates. On the left are the bias corrected lapse rates that we use, and then on the right are the station observations, and the lower distributions are the bias data. So this shows the temporal variability of lapse rates computed for our study region. The upper right is the station observations. So you can see that they deviate widely from the kind of commonly assumed values. These are east side stations only. Yeah, so this is east side lapse rates. I don't have a figure showing the west side, but actually they're quite similar in that they have a similar temporal pattern and slightly steeper, actually, surprisingly, on the west side than the east side.
Last question.
The conclusion, Cougar Reservoirs 300%, that was the magnitude of the change if it were all in Cougar Reservoir, but it's for the whole McKinsey.
Right.
So that's a flood control project. What's the management implication of that?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, I think it would make flood control easier. Well, but the problem is that the snowpack is melting earlier. And so if the reservoir is filling earlier, for flood control purposes, they are obligated to release water to manage for the potential for floods. So if that's part of the problem is that if the snowpack is melting earlier and the reservoirs are filling earlier, the managers need to release the water. And so then the water's been released, and if the snowpack's melting earlier, then you don't have the late season melt to fill the reservoir throughout the summer when the water is needed most critically. So does that answer your question? Okay.
All right. Thank you, Matthew.
Yep.